Let's get started. Thank you so much for being here on time, everyone. Good evening, and welcome to the League of Women Voters of Broward County, Florida. This is our November general meeting, and it's wonderful to see all of you, our new members, our lifelong members, friends, and our guests. Whether this is your first meeting or your 50th, on behalf of myself, Suzette Hyde, and my co-chair, Allison Myers, we're truly glad that you are here. Please note that tonight's meeting is being recorded and will be available afterwards on our YouTube channel. As we look back on this year, we can truly say we've accomplished a lot in our local league, across the state, and even on the national level. But as always, there's more work ahead, and that's what makes being part of this league so inspiring. Thank you to all of you who've given your time, your ideas, and your energy. You are the reason this organization thrives. So speaking of celebration, we have a fun event coming up this Sunday at Funky Buddha Brewery in Fort Lauderdale. Funky Buddha Brewery. Let's say that 3 times fast. And you don't have to drink to come to this event. It is a restaurant, and you can have whatever drink makes you excited and happy. Members, you're invited to come as our guest free of charge. Just make sure you're registered. And as of today, we already have over 60 members signed up. Is that right, Allie? I don't know if Allie's muted or not.
Yeah, I think we're about 62, 63.
Okay, wonderful. But there's still room for more. So if you are a guest or you would like to bring one, you are more than welcome to join us for a small fee. If you are not a member, you're still welcome to join us. It's going to be a great afternoon to connect, unwind, and celebrate another successful year as a nonpartisan organization dedicated to empowering voters and defending democracy. You know, we pride ourselves on what unites us, not what divides us. And that's why we don't support political parties or partisan events. But we do take strong stands on important issues, only after thorough study and thoughtful discussion. So if you enjoy that kind of deep engagement, please join us for our final business meeting of the year, which is this Saturday at 10 a.m. Please register at our website. It's a chance to engage with our board, hear from our committees, review our finances, and help plan the exciting work ahead for 2026. As the holidays approach, I hope you'll also take time to connect with family, neighbors, and even those who may see things differently. That's where democracy truly begins, in conversation, in community, and in mutual respect. And of course, if you're not yet a member of the league, please consider joining us. Membership is still at under $100 a year, well under $100 a year. And you know, really, what else can we get for it? I think it's about $75. Is that what it is? Linda, is Linda on? Maybe she's
I'm here. I'm sorry. What was your question?
The membership dues are
$20 minimum. Give whatever you want.
Oh my goodness. Say
oh
that
my goodness, this is a year already. Yeah, you pay your dues to the national organization. They will keep 33% of whatever you pay. They will send 47% to the state organization, and Broward County League of Women of Voters will get 20% of whatever you pay for your membership. Some of you have been incredibly generous. Some of you have chosen the $20 or $30 and then made a direct donation to our chapter in lieu of paying more dues. It's entirely up to you. All the information is on our website where you go to join or renew. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Linda. And of course, if you have any questions, Linda's always available to answer. We also have opportunities for you to donate, not just monetarily, but donate your time to the league as well. So I want to open the floor for any other important announcements before we move on to our speaker. If you have an announcement to make that you would like for our general audience to hear about what's going on at the league, now's your opportunity to do that. Okay, well, I'm sure all of you are signed up also for our event on Sunday, so I look forward to seeing you then as well. But without further ado, let's move into tonight's program. We are honored to welcome Dr. Thomas C. Ellington, a distinguished political scientist, civic leader, and author whose career reflects a lifelong commitment to public service and community engagement. Dr. Ellington has served for more than 20 years at Wesleyan College, where he is now professor of political science, and this is at the Wesleyan College in Georgia. That's the female college. His teaching and scholarship focus on government transparency, local governance, and civic participation. Beyond academia, he's been deeply involved in local government, serving 6 years on the Macon City Council, chairing the Macon-Bibb County Land Bank Authority, and contributing to boards dedicated to transit, pedestrian safety, and community revitalization. He is also a Fulbright Senior Scholar, having taught in South Korea, and a Harvard Kennedy School graduate, where his projects addressed issues such as the Flint water crisis and the role of capital cities in democracy. His work bridges policy and people, turning research into practical solutions for a more responsive government, and just the type of guests we like to have at League of Women Voters. So tonight, Dr. Ellington will share insights from his new book, his lifelong effort to make democracy more transparent, accountable, and accessible to all citizens. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Thomas C. Ellington. You now have the floor.
Thank you so much. And I'm going to share my screen here because I have the classic face made for radio, and I happen to have a PowerPoint presentation set up here. So if I can actually send this full screen, there we go. Okay, so I want to thank you, first of all, for having me as a guest. One of the other hats that I wear right now is I'm a member of the Macon-Bibb County Board of Elections. And in that role, I see a lot of the good that our local chapter of the League of Women Voters does. We had to certify an election Monday from last week, and it only took about 5 minutes. It was routine. And as always, representatives from the League of Women Voters were in the room, which I think is really important in this day and age where we don't have the same kind of accountability mechanisms that we once would have been able to take for granted. So I'm certainly grateful for that. It's no secret that local news is in crisis. So we see a decline in the number of working journalists. I'm going to show you more about that in a minute. We have seen a closure of a lot of news outlets, and that's primarily newspapers, which turns out to be really important. We've seen a decline in newspaper circulation that has been going on basically for my entire lifetime. And we've seen a collapse in the advertising model over the last 20 years. And so we're going to look at a little bit about that. And of course, that photo on this slide is an empty newsroom, which is emblematic of the kinds of things that we're facing today. So this first graph here, this is the total number of working news analysts, reporters, and journalists as counted by the Bureau of Labor Statistics since 1999. And you'll notice that the general trend is downward. Nearly a third of newsroom jobs have disappeared since the turn of the century. and with 22,000 general purpose local governments in the United States. So that's cities, counties, townships, things like that. That would leave theoretically a maximum of 2 newsroom positions per government. But of course, we know not every working journalist has a local government beat. And in fact, one thing that we do know is that positions dedicated to public affairs journalism have been among the first to be on the chopping block this century. And this also may understate the problem. In addition to general purpose governments, we've got about 90,000 other governments, school districts, fire districts, things like that, many of which have significant power, revenue generating capacity, things that require somebody keeping an eye on them. We've seen circulation go down. And one thing that I want to emphasize here is it's not just the internet that's creating this problem. What we have here is average daily weekday circulation of newspapers between 1945 and I think 2022. And you'll notice that peaked in 1973. So that's a while ago. That's not the internet doing this. Something else has been going on. And if we have time, we can talk about some of the potential reasons for that. But in 1973, that was 63 million per day in a population that was, I guess, about half the size of the population of the United States today, maybe a little bit more. And again, if anything, this graph understates the extent to which the reach of newspapers has declined. If you control for population, then you see this decline actually start right after World War II. And some of that involves the rise of broadcast media, television, things like that. There was a time when where total newspaper penetration was 124%, meaning that the average household took in at least one newspaper, and in some cases more than one. That hasn't been the case in a very long time. Okay, so let's take a look at newspaper revenue, because this is a big part of the story. And this is not controlling for inflation. This is just actual dollars. Advertising and circulation revenue peaked in 2005 at $60.2 billion. And you'll notice that the blue part of this graph, that's advertising revenue. The orange part is circulation. And so it's worth noting here that advertising has collapsed more than circulation revenue has. It used to be that money that newspapers would get from the newsstand or from subscriptions was fairly minimal. It was an afterthought compared to the advertising revenue. Basically, JCPenney was paying for your news. And that's no longer the case. You'll notice that by today, we're dealing with much smaller total revenue, about a third of what it was in 2005, and that it's about half circulation revenue and about half advertising at this point. We have seen newspapers close. About a third of local newspapers closed in the 21st century. And according to a report that came out a couple of weeks ago, another 134 closed last year. And some troubling news on that is where in previous years, a lot of this had been newspapers that were owned by private equity or large chains. A lot of those 134 are family-owned papers, which suggests that even with the serious dedication to local news, the environment is getting tough to survive in. And I talk about newspapers a lot here because the story of the decline of local newspapers is very much, or local news is very much a story about the decline of newspapers in particular. No other medium has been so central to the coverage of local government, and none has seen such a stark decline in this century. Local newspapers, frankly, are a dying medium, and nothing yet has emerged to reliably replace them. We have seen some interesting experiments with digital-only outlets, and some of those are quite excellent, but they're not coming online fast enough to fill the gap that's being left with newsroom jobs going away and newspapers closing. And you might say, well, what about TV? TV is great for some purposes, but it's not the answer. Even if news directors decided to go all in just on public affairs journalism, there are structural limits to what they could practically do. To put it in Broward County terms, the TV stations are going to be able to cover Fort Lauderdale pretty easily. How often are they going to get to Coral Springs or Miramar? And the answer seems to be not very often. So according to the most recent data that I have, there are about 1,100 stations served by 697 newsrooms. Sometimes you have a single newsroom shared by more than one station. And for the most part, those are located in the leading metropolitan area in their market. And so there's an average of 31 local governments per television newsroom. That's a lot to cover, especially when you consider a typical 40-person station generally has 2 or 3 news reporters. There are obviously bigger ones. I'm sure you're familiar with some of the larger ones in your area. But that would work out to like 12 local governments per TV news reporter. And let me put this in concrete terms. So the median TV market in the United States today is the Thomasville, Tallahassee market up in North Florida, South Georgia. And the lead station there, the dominant station, is WCTV. They've got a fairly large newsroom. And if you're looking for coverage of the Tallahassee City Council or the Leon County Commission, they're going to do a pretty good job. But how often are they getting to Valdosta or Perry, which are also parts of their market? And the answer is not very often. And I'm not saying this to slam WCTV. I don't think that they're doing anything particularly blameworthy with their editorial decisions. The point is simply that it's not realistic to imagine that TV news could, in any meaningful way, fill the coverage gap left by shuttered and downsized newspapers. Television's great for some stuff. I intend to be watching football this weekend. It's great for conveying severe weather alerts and things like that. But serious coverage of local government does not play to the strengths of the medium. You might wonder about radio. And radio, I'm sorry, flip the head a little bit. Radio is very much a dead end as well. While there are some large newsrooms, you may listen to some of them, the median staff size for a radio newsroom in the United States is 1. And it's been at that figure since 1996 consistently. So for the typical radio newsroom, you're asking that one person to do an awful lot of heavy lifting if you're expecting them to do serious coverage of local governments. So one of the things that my research has made a big contribution on is this graph that I'm showing you right now. We know now that there are significant, enormous gaps in the coverage of local governments. Nobody had counted this until I conducted a couple of surveys in 2021 and 2023. We had great figures that I'd shown you on circulation, on newsroom jobs lost, on newspaper closures. We didn't have this. And so I worked with a group called Civic, which is a nonprofit survey organization, to do a first of its kind survey of local elected officials, 2021 and 2023. And what I found is that prior to the COVID-19 pandemic, according to the recall of the people that I had on the survey, 37.7%, more than a third of local governments had no reporters regularly covering them. During the Delta wave of the pandemic in 2021, that spiked to 52.2%, which is interesting because a lot of local governments went online at that point. And theoretically, it should be easier to do coverage, just like it's easier for me to speak to you via Zoom than for you to try to have me physically in Broward County tonight. There's since been a recovery. So that number without coverage dropped below 50% in fall of 2021, and it's dropped down to about a third according to the most recent survey I've conducted. So clearly the situation has been worse, could be worse, but I would argue that if you got 1 in 3 local governments that are functioning without any journalistic oversight, the situation's pretty bad. And now you might wonder how these numbers compare to earlier decades. how did this look before 2005 when the revenue model collapsed? I think that's a great question, and I wish I knew the answer to it, but I'm not aware of any existing data that would actually give us the answer. So this is a problem that's been on the radar for a while. By 2016, Penny Abernathy, who was working at the University of North Carolina, before she moved to Northwestern and before she retired, she came up with a new term, a news desert. And while it's challenging to measure news deserts, the idea is a pretty simple concept. It's a community, either rural or urban, with limited access to the sort of credible, comprehensive news and information that feeds democracy at the grassroots level. And we have a bunch of these. So this is from the Medill School at Northwestern's page. This is the current state of news deserts as they measure them at the county level. And I've got some concerns about these measures that I'll talk to you about in a little bit. But all those yellow counties, those are places that don't have a single news source in the county that is functioning. So you might be looking just to the north of you, and you'll notice that Martin County is a news desert. And if you spend any time up there, you might say, well, wait a minute, there's a newspaper in Stewart. And indeed there is, but it's a Gannett paper that mostly republishes copy from other newspapers. And on a good day, there will be one locally generated story. So that fits into the definition according to the folks at Medill. So there's about 200 of these. And then if you look at the light blue, those are counties where you have no more than one source of local news. So those are places where you might very well see those things turn yellow in future years. If you look at my home state, Georgia here, you'll notice that there's a bunch of things in yellow. And you might wonder why that is. I think part of it is we've got these tiny counties. So Florida has, what, 67 counties? Georgia has 159. And so that's just a lot more stuff to cover. Like I said, I've got some concerns with how these data are collected. For one thing, the measure is proprietary. And what that means is that there's a lot that the authors of this have written about their methodology, but at the end of the day, we can't look under the hood and try to replicate what they've done. We don't know exactly how they've made these judgments. There's some noise in the data. So a couple of years ago, I went to Taylor County, Georgia, because at that point, it was listed as having no local news source. And I wound up in a Reynolds City Council meeting, talking to the mayor ahead of time, and I asked him about news coverage. He said, oh yeah, so-and-so is the reporter. She always comes here. She took over after her daddy retired 20 years ago. But the Taylor County News doesn't have an online presence, and so I suspect it got missed because of that. To their credit, at Northwestern, they have made corrections on things like that. And the fact is, if you've got a large data set like this, there's going to be some errors. So I don't fault them for that. But my other big concern is measuring this at the county level, because what I've found is that there are municipalities, large ones, in counties that have reliable news sources, but that do not receive news coverage. So after I finish the book, that's the next direction that my research has gone in. Now, that said, I don't want to give the impression that I dislike the work that Penny Abernathy and her successors have done. I love it. It gives us insights we could not possibly have otherwise. It reminds me of something that Thomas Piketty said about another data set. He said, although the information was not perfect, it had the merit of existing. And as a political scientist, I deal with that kind of thing pretty frequently. So this was a jumping off point for me for some field research for this book. And so if you look at the little red dots here, these are 5 news desert counties that I visited in 2023, 2024. So you'll notice they're intentionally spread out geographically. They're very different places in terms of racial or ethnic demographics, in terms of prosperity or poverty, and they're in different places. So we've got everything from Mora County, New Mexico, which is a small place with about 8,000 people, to Martin County, which is, it's not the size of Broward, but it's not a small place by any stretch of the imagination. And so I did some talking to residents and elected officials there in those places. And I can tell you that there is a real hunger for local news. One thing that's interesting is that when you don't have a traditional news source, residents will try to create an alternative. And so there are things like Facebook groups. In Twiggs County, Georgia, I was told that I need to start paying attention to a group called Twiggs County Concerned Citizens. And it's an interesting group because you will have serious discussions of issues like whether a data center should be built there. And then you also have advertisements for duct cleaning scams. So there's just a huge variation of quality there. But the fact that people feel moved to do this, I think tells you something about them wanting to keep up with local government. And I know that elected officials I talk to, while they might have an adversarial relationship with the press, they also feel like they've lost the communication channel if they don't have access to somebody who's going to be coming to their meetings. One other interesting thing that happens is every now and then for communities that stream their meetings, a reporter will cover them, but remotely. So I talked to some folks in Sutter County, California, where they said they'd never actually met this reporter because she would just watch the stream from her home in North Florida and write stories based on that. And, that's better than no coverage, but it's not the same thing as, watching day in and day out and having a relationship with the people that you're covering. So what happens when local news coverage ends? I think it won't surprise you to find out that the answer is bad things happen. So voter turnout goes down, and that's particularly true if you have local elections that are in odd number years or not attached to presidential elections. If you do have higher offices on the ballot, you tend to have drop off, where people will vote for president or vote for governor and then just stop. And part of that is they don't feel like they have adequate information to make judgments about the people in the offices that are frankly closest to them and that are likely to have the largest impacts on their lives on a day-to-day basis. Municipal borrowing costs go up. If there's not somebody minding the store, that makes lenders on the bond markets nervous about how accountable the people in government are, and I think understandably so. So, as I said, the current definition misses some communities that lack adequate news coverage. And so what I've been doing for the past several months is looking at municipalities that are more than 100,000 people, but that are not the largest municipality in their county. So I'm not looking at Miami, but I'm looking at Miami Gardens. I'm not looking at Fort Lauderdale, but I'm certainly looking at Hollywood. And there are a bunch of these places, 34 by my preliminary count, that are what I would call hidden news deserts. They don't get the news coverage on their local governments, but they're in counties where there are really good, viable news sources that just aren't focused on them. So one example that got me interested in this is South Fulton, which is just south of Atlanta, shares the county with it. It was incorporated in 2017, about 117,000 people, 90% Black, by some estimates, the blackest city in the United States. And the Atlanta Journal-Constitution and the TV stations there just don't go. They showed up to cover the incorporation itself as part of this broader cityhood movement that was going on. When the mayor got arrested, they did stories about that, but they're not doing the day in, day out coverage that helps citizens keep their elected officials accountable. And so South Fulton is one of these places. There are 34 total. And I want to talk a little bit about how I figured this out, because it was painful and there's a reason that I haven't gone below population 100,000 yet. So for each of these communities that I identified as being over 100,000 and not the largest in their county, I looked first of all at a couple of news indices to see if I could find regular coverage of them there. I checked individual publications that were listed with the News Desert Project as being attached to those counties and looked through archives there. And if I couldn't find anything, then I started doing the additional work of calling librarians, calling city clerks, and also where there were chapters, calling leaders in local leagues of women voters. That's how I actually got connected to all of you tonight. And I must say that the league doesn't have chapters everywhere, but where they do have them, they've been universally helpful to me, and I'm genuinely grateful for that. So these are preliminary estimates. I'm doing a couple of other checks before I try to send this to publication. But you'll notice these are scattered in about 10 states. You know, you're not going to see them in states where you don't have a county with 2 cities with more than 100,000 people. So, you know, you're not going to have a suburban news desert in South Dakota or Wisconsin or Delaware. But there are some clusters, and those clusters are around San Francisco. There's another one around Southern California, another one around Dallas, and another one in and around Miami. So if you look at Miami-Dade County and you look at Broward County, a substantial portion of these are there, which is one of the reasons I ended up spending some time in Broward County over the summer. Let's say that we did drop the population parameter down to 50,000 people. I would expect that we would see a lot more points on this, this map in a lot more places. So we're just scratching the surface, but right now I'm only one person, and this is the best I can do at the moment. But I do want to share a little bit about what I found in some of these places. These are the suburban news deserts that I visited. So you'll see a couple of clusters here, one around Los Angeles, one in Broward County. So I visited Ontario and Rancho Cucamonga in California, spent some time in Miramar, Hollywood, and Coral Springs. I was actually in Coral Springs the night after the Game 6 of the Stanley Cup. I need to make a return visit to South Fulton, which is easy, and that's probably why I haven't done it yet. In general, there's a desire for local news in these places, just like there is in news desert counties. Community-wise, there's not a big difference. Now, there are some demographic differences. So these are fairly large communities. And if you look at like a Twiggs County, Georgia, or a Mora County, New Mexico, those are much smaller. But the desire to engage with government, the desire to know what's going on, the desire to hold people accountable, that's all there. And so I spent a little bit of time in Miramar. I'm sure you're familiar with it, so I'll kind of skip past my description with that. Miramar, for the most part, just receives occasional coverage, but not always, from Spanish language and Caribbean-focused weeklies. And if that were more frequent, that actually might serve, I think that would serve the needs of the community quite well. I will say that in some of these weeklies, what they run seems to be just like rehashed press releases rather than the result of independent reporting. But there are some publications that maybe could do more there if they had more resources. I know that one issue that came up that the mayor brought up to me there was an incinerator that the county is considering permitting, and there may have been a decision on that by now. I don't know. But what Mayor Messam told me is that reporters tend to come only when there is a big issue, and they tend to do their coverage remotely. So that's what the quote on the screen talks about. We go to Coral Springs. I was kind of thrilled to discover that Coral Springs is neither on the coast nor does it have any natural springs. It's just the name that a developer thought was a good idea some years ago, and I think that's striking. Coral Springs doesn't have regular news coverage anymore. They used to. They used to have 2 regular sources. One was folded, one was absorbed by the South Florida Sun Sentinel and turned into a local section. that just doesn't do as much with Coral Springs as the previous news outlet did. Interestingly, there are a couple of hyper-local digital sites that do offer occasional coverage, but it's generally based on pre-meeting documents. And you know that the documents that show up online, even on a very good system, don't necessarily reflect the deliberation that you see in an actual meeting. The mayor there said that he had not talked to any reporters in months. And there are, of course, other sources besides mayors, but I think it's pretty striking when the mayor of the community says that they're not talking to journalists at all, and it's not by choice. Okay, so let's move to California. Looking at two communities in the greater Los Angeles area in San Bernardino County, California. This is geographically the largest county in the lower 48 states. And city government in Ontario is covered by a paper called the Daily Bulletin about once every 2 months. When I was there was no Daily Bulletin reporter present. One of the residents I talked to, a man named Matthew Morrison, who said he was going to be running for council, described himself as a Republican activist. And he cited social media and blogs as his primary sources of information. And I asked him about the Daily Bulletin, and he said, well, it's $2 a copy, so I just don't bother. It's not worth it. And I think that is an issue. He's not the first person to tell me something similar. There's another outlet he referred me to called the San Bernardino County Sentinel, and that sounds like a really respectable newspaper. It's got a website that's built on the WordPress platform, and it's really more of a blog than a true newspaper. That said, something creative like that, with a little bit more in the way of resources, could fill the gap that's been left. And then I also went to Rancho Cucamonga. Rancho Cucamonga is the county seat. And the mayor there, Mayor Dennis Michael, told me that reporters used to be common attendees, but that hadn't been the case in at least 5 years. So we've got the quote here on the screen talking about how, they would get to know a new reporter when they came in, they would have relationships, they would call with questions, and there was some actual coverage going on. So that's a taste of the field research that I've been doing. The work on county level news deserts is going to show up in my book, Government Without Newspapers, which, depending on what my editor tells me, is going to come out probably early next year. Fingers crossed on that. Want to leave you with a little bit of advice on newspaper jobs that I ran across while I was doing research. This is from an old Twitter site called Overheard in the Newsroom, where an assistant managing editor was overheard telling a job candidate, if you can get a job in newspapers, do it now if you can. You can always get your master's when you get laid off. And that was 2009. I think that's very telling about the state of local news. And I hope that we can maybe spend some time in conversation with one another. I wanted to leave plenty of time for you to ask questions, make comments, etc. And so that concludes the formal portion of my presentation. If I can figure this out, I'm going to stop sharing the screen. There we go.
Job well done. Thank you so much. I appreciate all the information that you brought us. I think you confirmed a lot of the things that we thought about your research, that there is a correlation between voter turnout and these news deserts. And we happen to have some people who are formerly employed with some of the newspapers that are down here in South Florida. So I'm sure that they have some comments and some questions for you so that we can engage in a dialogue. And so I'm going to open the floor for anyone who has any questions, any comments that you want to make. Allie, you have your hand up. Go ahead, please. You're muted, Allie.
Okay, Thomas, we spoke briefly before you signed up for this, and you may not remember this, but I ran television stations for half of my career. I worked at Fox Television Stations, Tribune, A lot of big groups, big markets. And I think the one thing that everybody needs to know, to be aware of, that there is a lot that has been happening, and it hasn't happened overnight. This has been happening for a long period of time. I think there's a lot of mistrust, a lot of misinformation that's out there across all the platforms, whether it's TV, whether it's newspaper, radio. I think that a lot of people do get their news from social media, and that's a big mistake unless it's quite frankly something that starts with the Washington Post or a New York Times. A lot of people just read it and just assume that the information is correct, and it's not. In fact, because of the high Hispanic penetration that we have in Miami, we did a contract with Fact Check Cuidado, which is an agency that is a news organization that focuses on disinformation. So that's a big piece. I think the other piece that people need to understand is in Tallahassee, it's like market 100 or 145. That's market size. Miami, Fort Lauderdale is market number 18. And when you're looking at the TV stations, they don't have the ability to just target a county. They only have the ability to target a DMA. Now, cable could do it, radio could do it, and social media could do it, but we can't do it from that standpoint. So you can't mix the newspaper with the TV pool because it's a little bit different. So I just wanted everybody to understand that there are very big differences between newspaper readership, listenership on radio, viewership on television. They reach very different audiences, and I just wanted to make the distinction between all of them so there isn't any confusion. Thank you.
I appreciate that. I think those are points that are well taken. One thing I didn't talk about is there has been some convergence among media with the move to the web. And so if you look at a big TV station's website or a big newspaper's website, they're going to have a lot of features in common at this point. But the limitation I talked about is there just aren't enough TV stations to do all the heavy lifting that needs to be done when we're talking about this.
Great, thank you. And thank you, Ali, for clarifying that. I think that we recognize that Dr. Ellington has taken on a big project here where he's not just addressing newspapers, but just news sources in general. And it's, in this nationwide survey. So we appreciate the magnitude of the research and what you're trying to bring us. Linda, you have a question or a comment?
Comment, of course. First of all, thank you, Dr. Ellington. I find that very interesting. And like you, I've been following the demise of newspapers for quite a few decades now with mixed feelings. As a member of an organization that promotes voting, I think we have learned that our younger voters probably wouldn't read the newspaper even if they could. They go for their news to social media, and therein lies a huge problem because, as you discussed, there's not always truth in those stories. Plus the fact that I get 2 newspapers a day, and one of the things that I find incredibly disturbing are the salacious headlines, that draw your eyes to the story. But if you don't take a minute to read the story and see that it's really not necessarily related to the headline, then again, there's misinformation. So of concern to the league and other organizations like ours is, how do we get to these kids to give them facts, not opinions, but facts that will lead them to be educated voters?
I think that's a big challenge. And
yeah.
I don't have a magic formula. I wish I did. I do know that with some campaign experience, one of the things that's most effective in moving behavior is one-on-one contact. And the challenge with that, of course, is that there's only so many of you, and there's a lot of other people. You're right about young people's news habits. I hear a lot about TikTok, and it frightens me. One thing that I try to point out to my students is that they need to be careful and critical, because they neither control the algorithm nor do they necessarily know what's inside it. And I think that it's really important also that, while content gets created in a lot of different spaces, but the fact is that journalism is a craft that takes some time to learn, and there's some real value in having experienced reporters who know their beats, asking questions, following up, and doing the things that reporters have always done. I think the challenge right now is, do we get an audience, and how so? I will say that sensationalism is a very old problem. It predates all of us. I'm reminded that I did a little bit of reading about the history of the New York Sun when I was doing research for the book, and you may remember the New York Sun's moon hoax, where purportedly a telescope in South Africa had shown like an entire civilization on the moon. And of course, it was all made up. So, we had a version of fake news, in the 19th century. The problem is that the mechanisms for going viral today are much more rapid and not particularly predictable, although somebody who works in social media may dispute with me on that and tell me that they have some techniques that they can use to make sure some things go viral.
Thank you.
Thank you. Ronnie, you had your hand up. Did you want to respond
Yeah,
to this?
excuse me, I did, I'm sorry. Sort of the challenges that we have today with mis and disinformation and the consolidation of so many radio stations and networks with like an organization like Sinclair, so that it's so hard for people. Oh, Jimmy Kimmel, another example where a lot, I think it was ABC or whichever channel he's with, one of the networks refused to show his show, to broadcast it. So we're not only losing information, the control of what we get is laser focused. Aren't you finding that? What do you think of that?
I think that you pointed out a couple of things there that I want to talk about. One is disinformation, and the other one is media consolidation. So hold me to it, make sure that I talk about both of those things, please. In terms of media consolidation, if you think about Sinclair in particular and the number of stations that they own across the United States, they legally would not have been allowed to do that 30 or 35 years ago. And the FCC has loosened rules on how much of a market you can control, how much of the entire US population a single company can reach in broadcast. There were never those limits in print media because you didn't have the scarcity doctrine, but we have seen enormous consolidation in broadcast media. In TV, Sinclair is emblematic of that. In radio, you may remember the consolidation of a bunch of stations into the Clear Channel corporate embrace, which I think has now turned into something that sounds friendlier called iHeartRadio. One thing that absolutely is true is that there are bad actors seeking to spread disinformation or just make money, not particularly caring about what they're putting out there. So one phenomenon I talk about in the book is the proliferation of what we call pink slime sites. And these are things that look like they might be the website of a local newspaper. A lot of them are centrally owned and managed, and they're not particularly reliable as a source of news, and that's to put it very mildly. And so those are things that are out there, and particularly if you're not really savvy about how you scrutinize the information that is coming in, one website looks pretty much like another to the uncritical eye. And so that creates a real problem. I don't have great news on countering that. I wish I had a better potion of some kind to deal with that. But I think you're right to point out those concerns.
You know, in your research, you highlighted several areas that are in Broward County, Miramar, and Coral Springs, which, thank you for that information. It didn't occur to me where the springs in Coral Springs, right? But you said that coverage has nearly disappeared in those areas, and you had up a couple of quotes from those mayors. You know, you had them on the screen. You didn't read them out loud, but my question is, you know, what surprised you most in speaking with community leaders from these places? Because I found the quotes to be pretty interesting.
You know, by the time I had gotten to the work I've been doing over the summer, I'd interviewed a bunch of people, and so some themes had already emerged. If you had asked me prior to when I started this research, I would have expected more elected officials to be happy about the absence of reporters, because there is sometimes an adversarial relationship there. But it's also sometimes not adversarial. But we know that sometimes elected officials try to get away with something if nobody's watching. And I'll give you a dramatic example of that. When I was in Twiggs County, Georgia last year, which is about a 25-minute drive from where I am, nobody had done news coverage in Twiggs in something like 10 years. And I went into this meeting, introduced myself to the commissioners. They were really friendly. They were happy to see me. They had me introduce myself to everybody in commission chambers at the beginning of the meeting. I sat there and I took notes. And then at the end of the meeting, the chair announced that they were going to close the meeting to deal with litigation, personnel, and real estate. And under the Georgia Open Meetings Act, that's kind of the holy trinity of exemptions. But you know, in serving in elected office and going to a bunch of meetings over 20 years, I'd never seen all three invoked simultaneously. And frankly, I didn't believe it was true. And so I asked the chair to clarify, and he did. And I didn't really have standing to tell him that he was lying to us. But afterward, I went and checked the minutes for the last year. And other than one pro forma meeting that had lasted 5 or 10 minutes, they literally had closed every single meeting in that past year. And that's because nobody's there telling them not to. I did some more research on the chair of that county commission, and also found that he was a rather interesting character. He previously was a probate court judge. And in 2010, the Georgia Supreme Court removed him and barred him from holding judicial office on recommendation from the Judicial Qualifications Commission, because he'd been doing things like accepting cases that weren't in his jurisdiction, telling defendants in his courtroom that they had the burden of proof to prove their innocence. And so he got removed as a probate court judge, turned around and ran for county commission, and he's been there ever since.
Wow.
I think somebody like that probably needs someone looking over their shoulder.
Oh, absolutely. Very interesting. Twigg County has how many people?
About 8,500. So if you ever saw the TV series Here Comes Honey Boo Boo, she was from the county just south of there. They are both counties that are rich in kaolin, which is a white chalky substance you may be familiar with as an original ingredient in kaopectate. And they're very poor counties. The kaolin mining industry collapsed about 20 years ago. And so there's not a lot of people there, and there's not a lot of opportunity.
Interesting. And the Facebook groups that they said that they had, did you find that there was a lot of information on there?
There is some, and particularly Twiggs just approved a new data center, which is going to draw more electricity than Macon and Augusta combined. And a bunch of people were up in arms about that. It's interesting seeing the organizing going on there, because while there hasn't been much in the way of news coverage yet, the people are very engaged. And as far as I can tell, they're circulating petitions to require a referendum that could reverse that decision. And that's something that's not usually done in Georgia, but that is an option that's available to them under the law. And I'm going to be curious to see how that works out.
So in your view, can digital or citizen journalism like truly fill the gap left by traditional local newspapers, or do we lose something that's irreplaceable? Because the reason I say that is because there's an assumption that if it's written in the newspaper, then we can trust it. But I remember being in college and a professor asking that question, if somebody writes in a newspaper, is it true? Can we believe it? And while there is some accountability, I'm not sure that because it's written in a newspaper that it's more trustworthy than another source, right? But what's your opinion on that one, on comparing the newspapers to, like YouTube channels now?
I mean, there's something special
Yeah.
about, having your kid's picture appear in the newspaper at graduation, having the high school football scores. There's some community building things that newspapers do too. But I think that if there's going to be an answer to this problem, a lot of it is going to be digital. If we're talking about what's going on 20 or 25 years from now, I'm not sure how many people are going to be getting newsprint on their hands. And frankly, if news is being covered somewhere and citizens have reasonable access to information, that doesn't even really make me sad. Right now, the problem is that digital outlets are not cropping up at the same rate that newspapers are closing. And so we're not seeing sufficient replacement, but they can do some interesting things. So in DeKalb County, Georgia, which is just adjacent to Atlanta, there is an online-only site called Decatorish that was founded 5 or 10 years ago, and they will go to some of the smaller communities and cover city council meetings and things like that. I thought that I was going to find some smaller news deserts in DeKalb County when I happened to be up there and looking around, and it turns out that a lot of these communities have a reporter who regularly shows up because this digital only outlet exists and it's dedicated to news in DeKalb County at a time when the Atlanta Journal-Constitution has really pulled back and retrenched. And that's great, but then you drive 30 or 45 minutes to South Fulton and there's not an equivalent outlet there. And I think one other thing to remember, I mean, we're having a great time talking on video here. We're using a fair amount of bandwidth, and where we are, we can take that for granted. There are places where that's not true. And there are some places where if you don't have a physical newspaper still, that news isn't going to get to somebody because they don't have broadband access. And so the digital divide, I think, is getting better. I think that some of this self-provided internet access may be part of the answer, but we're not there yet.
Are there any statistics on like reading and critical thinking? Because I mean, it's one thing for somebody to tell you and spoon feed you the information as opposed to you reading it yourself and trying to process that. So is there any data on that? Is that in your book?
I am sure there are data. I don't have them at my fingertips. But I can tell you, for instance, that in the early days of TV news, Walter Cronkite was very concerned to learn that television news was becoming the preeminent source for Americans at that point. And part of that is simply a bandwidth issue. So television does great with immediacy. You don't want to wait for that newspaper to hit your doorstep to find out about a tornado warning. And it does great with moving images. But in terms of actual words that get conveyed, generally, most people can read faster than somebody can articulate words in a spoken medium. And so I think the stat that I've seen cited before is that a typical half-hour newscast has about the same number of words as like 2 pages of a printed newspaper. And there's some definite economy of writing that forces. And so like TV does some things very, very well, but if you're trying to convey a lot of complex information, the written medium is really better. And that's one thing that I'm curious to see as we see some of this convergence, is how much TV stations take advantage of of their websites to provide kind of the best of both worlds.
The one
Any
thing you want to
and
consider
Ally?
your research is the nonprofit news that's coming out across the country. There's a company called the American Journalism Project that is nonprofit news in newspapers and online. And they use the resources of their entire marketplace. Television, radio, whoever wants to be a part of it, they all share the content. And that is a huge thing that's on the rise. In fact, I'm being told that Miami, Fort Lauderdale is getting one in the next year or so.
I think that nonprofit news is very much part of the answer if we succeed in turning this around. I mean, we've seen some early adopters like Pointer. There's the National Trust for Local News, which has a number of state affiliates, including Georgia, where right now, starting from scratch from a couple of years ago, there's now 20 not-for-profit newspapers in Georgia, including a brand new one in my hometown that I suspect is going to basically rule the market when the Macon Telegraph, under the tutelage of Chatham Asset Management, goes belly up. We haven't talked a ton about the finances beyond advertising revenue, but one thing that's a big part of the story is that for a very long time, newspapers were returning double-digit profit margins. And so they were very attractive for investors because they could buy newsprint cheap, put some stuff on it, and sell it more expensively. And Thomson newspaper group in the 1980s, Gannett to some extent, really pioneered some of the bloodletting that you saw in newspapers, where you would end up cutting costs as much as possible, cut news gathering capability, and then make your paper less attractive to readers, which then loses subscribers, which makes it less attractive to advertisers, and you end up in kind of a death spiral. About 20% of newspapers today are owned by private equity. And the private equity model doesn't necessarily require a prosperous quality product to make money for investors. We've seen this in other fields, like with the bankruptcy of Red Lobster. There are ways where you can basically harvest as much as you can from a resource that you purchased, end up having it closed down, and still make money. And the way I describe this in the book is that, there are owners in these for-profit businesses that are perfectly happy to kill the goose that laid the golden egg if the market price of goose flesh is high enough.
Yeah.
You talked about potential reasons for a decline in newspaper circulation since 1973. Well, you mentioned it. What are some potential reasons?
I think some of it in the early days, some of that comes as there was competition from broadcast. And newspaper publishers going back to the 1930s were very, very concerned about competition from other media. There was quite a war that went on for a little while where the Associated Press, where newspaper publishers attempted to prevent AP from sharing its feed with radio stations because they were afraid of radio as a competitor. And so I think that that's early on part of it. I think that also as we get into the 70s and 80s, a lot of publishers got fat and happy. You saw a lot of consolidation with big chains, and you saw some things that would lead to the kind of death spiral that I was talking about, where you decrease the quality of the paper, you hurt the audience, the advertisers aren't as interested, you end up long-term losing revenue, and it just goes from there. So I think that is part of it. And then, of course, today, we've got a generation of folks coming into adulthood where the habit of reading a newspaper or systematically keeping up with the news in some other fashion isn't a habit. And I think, I know from talking to my students that a lot of them do want to know what's going on in the world. There's a genuine curiosity, but they don't necessarily always understand how to get to the information that they need.
And so much is competing for the information now.
And I would like to say one other thing about nonprofit. One place where we've seen an interesting success story is with State House coverage. All 50 state capitals now have nonprofit newsrooms that do some pretty good work. And I'm hoping that's a model that's going to be emulated and grow more successful over time. One thing's true is that if you're trying to sustain your publication and you don't have to be providing investors with double-digit profit margins, then that makes it a little bit easier. But even not-for-profit outlets still have to have some kind of revenue coming in. And some of that can be from philanthropies for a time. But at the end of the day, you have to have an audience. And if you don't have an audience, then what's the point of putting out the publication?
Any other comments, questions? Allie, Linda?
I think Ricky had a comment. I see Ricky's hand up.
Oh, please go ahead.
Ricky, honey, you're on mute.
Okay. Well, in Broward County, we have a newspaper and they do some really good investigative journalism. But I've noticed the trend toward fewer and fewer substantive articles and more of what I would describe as fluff. I suspect that is kind of widespread.
Like opinion, Ricky?
Well, no articles about restaurants and food and that are not really important.
Yeah.
Now, I've seen that in some of these dying newspapers where when a restaurant's about to open, you do a story about it, and then there's another story when it opens, and then you do a review, and that's like 3 things of content. And that's not terrible, but it's not a substitute for some of this deeper reporting. And I think one thing that's important to remember is if you're talking about true investigative journalism, it's expensive and it takes a long time. You may have a couple of reporters tracking down one story for months or even years at a time. And that kind of thing can be really valuable. If you've seen the movie Spotlight about the Boston Globe and the sex abuse scandal there, that's a great example of where some reporters did some serious work, getting into documents, interviewing people, really nailing down their sources, and coming out with important stories. And that's not something that you can do if you have to file 3 stories a day.
Tough. It's evolving. It's changing a lot. But I wouldn't get your news from social media, folks. That's the one thing I wouldn't get it from.
I will confess that when Pope Benedict abdicated, I learned about that from Facebook because a friend of mine posted something about how I don't like being Pope and I don't think I'm going to go anymore. But that also led me to go to the Washington Post website to try to find out what the heck was going on.
Right. Don't let it end there. Do your own research, verify the information. I think it's the same thing, you know.
It's a little suspect these days, isn't it? Because that's the Washington Post since Jeff Bezos took over the editorial page.
I'll tell you who the best one to read. And actually, you should read a few of them. But the Associated Press on digital has 0 hyperbole. It is just the facts. You don't have to figure it out. There's no dancing. There's nothing like that. It's just the facts. And I think that they do a really good job at laying out the facts.
Yeah. It's the original nonprofit too.
Yep.
The Associated Press.
Yeah.
On digital.
Thank you, Allison.
Of course.
Well, I asked my Alexa for news from around the world from different sources. And it's shocking to me how from different news agencies, we get the same news. The same thing. They're reporting on the exact same thing.
Yeah, it's just
I,
orders.
I don't know if that's because they're studying, AI is studying what people are interested in, or it's just whatever is sensational, but it's all very similar. And so if you want to know something, you're going to have to research it, or you're going to have a good friend, somebody from maybe from the Legal Women Voters who's willing to sit down with you and give you some of that information, or somebody like Dr. Ellington who's willing to come on and provide us with something that is not initially on our minds and provide us with some new information. So
The best thing you can do is to read multiple sources and decide for yourself.
Yeah.
Just 2 or 3 papers that you have some level of trust with, and everything else will sort of follow the path. But that's what I would do.
And I'll say that I hear a lot of concerns about bias. And I think that worries me less than most people. For me, I think of bias as a point of view. And if you're aware of the point of view of whatever your source is, that's fine. What I'm more concerned about is credibility and intellectual honesty. And so, if I'm reading something in the Wall Street Journal, I know where they're coming from, but I also know that they do some pretty good reporting. If I'm reading the New York Post, I'm going to have more questions.
But the New York Times, you can get it depends. I mean, depends on who's writing the story. But the New York Times is pretty, I wouldn't say balanced, but if you compare that to the Wall Street Journal, I mean, you're going to see some differences, and that's why I'd say if you read that, the New York Times and AP, you would be able to come up to your own decision as to what you believe is the real deal.
thank you, Allie. Thank you, Dr. Ellington. Anybody else has any comments? I saw Denise McFall give a thumbs up to making sure that you get your information from a lot of sources, not just one. Anyone else wants to make a comment?
No, it was great information. Thomas, it was a pleasure to hear your perspective and learn about your research. It's a very murky environment out there. I'm oversensitive to it because I've been in it for 40 years, and it's very frustrating to me from where I came from to what it is today. And I hope someone figures it out. I think the nonprofit news, though, is definitely something that we could all wrap our arms around at some point. And I think we're going to have one here. So I think that'll be good.
Yeah.
Public Citizen and Politico are also good sources.
Both good.
Wonderful.
Well, I think that nonprofit piece is one glimmer of hope in an area that's mostly grim right now. And so I hope that we will see some success in that area, and maybe that's where we turn things around.
Yeah, they're raising a lot of money, a ton of money.
Oh, yes.
Well, you've given us an invitation to stay curious, stay engaged, and support our local news. And also to, we have a new Observer Corps co-chair, and we have great aspirations for her. She's going to bring us information. Organization like ours attending local meetings, particularly in these areas, Miramar and Coral Springs, these areas where they're not getting the coverage, and us putting it in our newsletters and circulating it, I think could at least make up for some of the gap that we have. So thank you again, Dr. Ellington. We invite everyone to support his book, and tell us when your book will be out, the name of your book again, and when it will be available.
So the name of the book is Government Without Newspapers, Local Politics in the Age of News Deserts. It's supposed to be published by Bloomsbury. I do not have a release date. So I've been in communication with my editor, going back and forth on when we get around to that. And the answer I'm still getting right now is a few more weeks, but I will be sure to communicate with you when I have a date that's more certain.
Wonderful. Thank you. So
Get more research. Please let us know. We'd love to have you come back and tell us any updates that you have.
I would be delighted to do that. Thank you so much for your hospitality.
And I hear you say you're looking for volunteers. I mean, what you're doing is on a national level, a one-man operation. Sounds like a daunting task, but if you're looking for volunteers as well, we'd be happy to get the word out to help you in that regard.
I will definitely keep you posted. Thank you so much.
So on behalf of Legal Women Voters of Broward County, we thank you, Dr. Thomas C. Ellington, for sharing your insight, your passion, and your ongoing commitment to civic life. So everyone, for a round of applause to Dr. Ellington. We wish you all the best, and we hope that you will come back again.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Good night.
Good
Good
night,
night.
everyone. All right, so we do not have a meeting in December. Just to remind you, our next general meeting is in January, and we hope to see all of you there. Bye.
Thank you. Good night.